Hi everyone, it's Saul, and today I am finally back in the Peak District. So it's been almost 8 months now since my last Peak District visit. Wasn't really intentional, I just haven't really had time to get out here much lately. But I'm back today. I've just left Grindleford about 5 minutes ago, and I'm going to be doing a roughly 14-mile circular walk, which I'm calling the Edges Walk. I'll let VoiceOver Saul tell you more about it.
So the idea behind today's walk is to visit no less than 6 stone edges on the eastern side of the Peak District in one fell swoop. Our journey begins at Grindleford railway station in Nether Padley, and from there we immediately begin our ascent, passing through Oaks Wood and out onto grassy farmland, which we'll cross to reach Tumbling Hill. This is the first landmark on today's walk, but it's not our first edge. For that, we'll continue through Haywood until we meet the A625, on the other side of which we'll find Froggatt Edge, which sits on the northern end of a roughly 3.5km stone escarpment we'll be following through to Curbar Edge and, after crossing Clodhall Lane at Curbar Gap, Baslow Edge. At the southern end of Baslow Edge we find Wellington's Monument, from which we start to descend as we approach Bar Brook and cross the A621. We then skirt around the southern tip of Gardom's Edge, which we'll visit properly later, and continue across more grassland until we reach the A619, the southernmost point of today's journey. For about 400 metres we follow the A619 and B6050 before turning northward and following this trail towards Birchen Edge. Along this edge we'll find Nelson's Monument and a trig point, from which we descend again towards the southern tip of Gardom's Edge. This time we'll actually follow the edge, heading north until we once again meet the A621. Crossing this and Bar Brook, we then meet this footpath which will take us back to Wellington's Monument, but this time, instead of following Baslow Edge, we take this footpath via Eagle Stone, which will ultimately bring us back to Curbar Gap. From here we head along this trail which will take us up to White Edge, the 6th and final edge of today's walk. We follow this edge for roughly 3 km, passing another trig point along the way, and when we reach the northern end we descend back towards the A625, past Grouse Inn, through Haywood, and finally back into Nether Padley. All in all, today's walk should work out at a little over 22 km, or a little under 13.7 miles. The highest point will be White Edge Trig Point at 365 metres above sea level, and the lowest is just outside Grindleford railway station at 165 metres.
This is also the first Peak District video I've done since I started filming in landscape, but I'm still going to do the piece to camera stuff in portrait like this, just because it's easier for me to hold my phone like this while I'm walking and talking. So my first port of call for today is Tumbling Hill, which is where we've just arrived. There's a fantastic view of Grindleford down there behind me, and here is a big old rock face.
Tumbling Hill, also known as Jubilee Hill, is a former gritstone quarry which sits right over Nether Padley. It doesn't appear on Google Maps, it doesn't have a Wikipedia page, and there's surprisingly little information about it anywhere else on the internet, but what it does offer is some spectacular views of Grindleford, Derwent Valley, and Hope Valley off in the distance. A pretty stony little pathway here up to the top. And once again, just look at the view from up here. You can see the village of Grindleford down there. If I keep panning, off in the distance across the Vale of Edale is Win Hill, and a bit further over you can just about make out Stanage Edge way off in the distance there. And there is Higgator, which we visited in our very first Peak District video. Okay, leaving Tumbling Hill behind now, our first landmark of the day, and already we've done a pretty significant climb. I'm a bit exhausted, to be honest with you, but then again, it has been 8 months since I got out here and stretched my legs as much as this, so I'll warm up to it. I think it might be time to crack open the first fruit shoot, actually. There are red ants everywhere, by the way. Guess it's just that time of year for them. The Peak District is absolutely beautiful at this time of year, don't get me wrong, but there are plenty of insects about, so just remember to keep your ankles covered. Crossing the A625 brings us to the northern end of the larger escarpment on which Froggatt Edge lies. I've already covered the formation of the Peak District's many gritstone edges in my very first walk, but here's a basic rundown in case you missed it. During the Carboniferous period, the land which would later form Britain and Ireland was submerged by a shallow sea. This sea was full of carbon-rich life, and over countless millennia, deceased creatures would leave behind their hard shells, which would eventually be compacted into a thick layer of limestone. Sometime later, rock erosion in surrounding areas would deposit a large amount of debris in the vicinity of today's Peak District, which would compress into a large dome of hard, coarse gritstone. In time, this too would be eroded, hollowing out the centre of the dome to expose the underlying limestone while leaving behind a chain of gritstone escarpments. Today, the area behind these escarpments is known as the High or Dark Peak, while the low-lying limestone is known as the Low or White Peak, essentially splitting the Peak District into two distinct but equally picturesque areas, solidly divided by its iconic edges.
One thing I am grateful for is that there's been quite a lot of shade on this walk so far. It's been mostly woodland, which I imagine is going to change when I get closer to the top of Froggatt Edge. I think my two favourite things about the Peak District are the views and the wildlife. There is just so much variety here, so many plants, birds, insects. As someone who spends quite a lot of their time sat at a computer, live streaming, video editing, and so on and so forth, getting out into nature once in a while is so therapeutic. Okay, we're now approaching edge number 1, Froggatt. There it is. And of course, as predicted, the trees have disappeared. That there is the very last one.
Froggatt Edge, along with nearby Curbar Edge, is among the most popular rock climbing spots on the eastern side of the Peak District, and standing atop these imposing walls of gritstone, it's easy to see why. Gritstone is famed for its incredible coarseness, providing an exceptional level of purchase for climbers to grip onto. Even if you aren't a climber, there are numerous smaller boulders strewn about that you can try your hand at, and you'll be surprised by just how easy they are to climb. That's not to downplay the abilities of rock climbers in any way, because climbing something like this is seriously impressive, no matter what it's made of. It was at this point that I unknowingly crossed from Froggatt Edge to Curbar Edge, though the sudden change in elevation should have been a bit of a giveaway. And faced with yet another exceptional view across Derwent Valley, this seemed like as good a time as any to sit down for a quick snack.
Okay, I've just found a nice quiet spot on Curbar Edge, which is our second edge of the day. I'm just going to sit for a minute and grab a little snack. In case you were wondering about my lunch, by the way, I've got 2 half sandwiches, 1 coronation chicken and 1 cheese and onion. We got some sliced pepper and cucumber with an apple buried underneath, some grapes and nuts, and under here a couple of savoury bites. And just over there in the distance you can see Baslow Edge, which is where we're going next. It is a beautiful spot to just sit for a while.
But sitting for a while doesn't help us to cover the almost 11 miles still to walk, so with my batteries sufficiently recharged, I quickly got back on the move. You may be wondering at this point how some of these edges got their names, and in the case of Froggatt, Curbar and Baslow edges, the answer's pretty simple. Froggatt Edge is named after the village of Froggatt, which the edge overlooks. Curbar Edge, on the other hand, is named after the village of Curbar, which the edge overlooks. And of course, who could forget Baslow Edge, named after the village of Baslow, which the edge overlooks. How did the villagers get their names? That's outside the scope of this video.
Okay, we're just coming toward the end of Curbar Edge now, and as you can see, the wind has certainly been having a go at my hair. It's holding on for dear life. But just ahead of me is Baslow Edge, 3 of 6, here we come. Okay, so we're now on to Baslow Edge, our third edge of the day. It's surprisingly quiet up here. Curbar is definitely the more popular edge. There's almost nobody around up here. I'm not complaining though, it just gives me more opportunity to talk to the camera. Not that I've really got much to say, to be honest.
Allow me.
Now there's a funny looking rock.
Thank you, son. Baslow Edge, despite being located immediately south of and part of the same escarpment as Curbar and Froggatt edges, is significantly less popular with walkers and climbers alike. There are a few good climbs, and equally there were a few walkers, but it definitely has a far more relaxed atmosphere than its much busier neighbours. Baslow Edge is also a free-range grazing spot for local Highland cattle, though rather disappointingly there were none about today.
Another absolutely stunning view. Very well balanced stone there. Got a little bit of graffiti on it, but we'll ignore that. Just over there is Eagle Stone, which we'll be visiting on our way back. Gotta say, I'm not liking this bit very much. We are wading through some very thick ferns right now, and we're very close to the edge, so I should probably stop recording and concentrate on where I'm going.
Fortunately, I managed to make it through the ferns in one piece, but this wouldn't be my last encounter with them on today's walk, and as you'll soon see, they can really get out of control on some of the lesser used paths in the area. Anyway, my next point of call was Wellington's Monument, a roughly 10-foot stone cross erected in 1865 to commemorate the Duke of Wellington's victory at the Battle of Waterloo some 50 years prior. Why is it out here in the middle of the Peak District? That's a question for later. Right now, though, I'd been walking for over 4 hours, and was starting to feel a little bit peckish again.
Okay, so I've just found myself a bench. We've just passed Baslow Edge, the third of our 6 edges today. You can see Wellington's Monument just there behind me. I'm going to have my proper dinner now, because we're about halfway through the walk, and then I'm going to carry on to Birchen, Gardom and White Edge. I'm going to put on a bit of sun cream as well, because it is really beating down right now.
Getting back on the trail, I began to descend through this picturesque woodland towards Barbrook and the A621. While I wasn't able to find much information about this particular woodland online, the trees around the base of Gardom's Edge are listed as ancient woodland. In the UK, ancient woodland refers to any area which has been continuously wooded since before the practice of planting woodland became widespread in around 1600. In other English-speaking countries, such areas are often referred to as old-growth woodland.
Look at the size of those dock leaves. This might sound like an exaggeration, and I know you can't get a great sense of scale on the video, but those leaves are genuinely larger than my entire body. Amazingly, I've been walking for 4 hours, and I'm still on my first fruit shoot. But, to be fair, I have had 2 sandwiches and most of my cucumber and pepper, so... We might not be making great time right now, but I have had such an incredible walk today. So many different landscapes, you know, from the top of the peaks to the woodland to the ferns. It has been just breathtaking. Very thick ferns again here. It's difficult to see the path ahead of me. But look at that view.
Now's probably a good time to remind you that when wading through thick foliage like this, you should always be mindful of bites or stings from small inverts, particularly ticks, which can carry some very nasty diseases. Despite wearing jeans, thick socks and hiking boots, I actually came home with a small tick attached to my ankle. Of course, I immediately removed it and will continue to monitor for any signs of infection, but it just goes to show that even parts of the body not exposed to the elements are still susceptible to bites, so just be vigilant.
Okay, so we're just coming up to the A619, which is the real halfway point of today's journey, and we have been walking for about 4.5 hours, so we're not making great time, I'll be honest, but when are we in these videos? Okay, up there is Birchen Edge, which is our next destination. We'll be up there in about half an hour or so, hopefully.
As we approach the A619, we find ourselves in the tiny hamlet of Robin Hood, a settlement comprised of just 3 properties, including the Robin Hood Inn and the Robin Hood Farm bed and breakfast.
Jesus Christ, that's a big style.
There's also a small car park here if you're wanting to visit Birchen Edge. Of course, having no need of a car park, inn or bed and breakfast, I didn't think they were worth filming, and so I pressed on towards Birchen Edge.
Oh, it's almost vertical. Marvellous. Just over there in the distance you can see what I think is Curbar Edge. Hard to believe we were there just a couple of hours ago. Well, true to my word, we have made it to the top of Birchen Edge in half an hour. And let me tell you, it was the single most grueling part of today's walk. I'm telling you now, some of those sections from the A619 were almost completely vertical. But, edge number 4.
Birchen Edge is another fairly popular climbing spot, and there were indeed a few climbers about while I was there. I couldn't find any information online regarding the edge's name, but the southern end is nestled beside a thick birch woodland, so I think we might be able to piece this one together. One particularly notable landmark on Birchen Edge is Nelson's Monument, a roughly 10-foot stone column erected in 1810 to commemorate the life of Admiral Horatio Nelson. If that sounds familiar, it's because this monument would later inspire the creation of nearby Wellington's Monument. So that's why there's a monument to the Duke of Wellington in the middle of the Peak District. Why is there a monument to Lord Nelson in the middle of the Peak District? I don't know. A short while later I arrived at Birchen Edge Trig Point, one of 2 trig points we'll be visiting on today's walk, and considering several other trig points have appeared in my previous Peak District videos, I think it's about time we talked about what they actually are. But first let's go to Gardam's Edge.
So I have fully locked in and done some serious walking in the last 20 minutes or so. That there is Birchen Edge, where we've just come from, and here is Gardam's Edge.
At just 280 metres above sea level, Gardam's Edge is by far the lowest edge on today's walk, and I must admit it didn't feel particularly impressive at first.
I've got to say, this edge is much less apparent, shall we say, than the other 4.
As I kept walking, however, I quickly realised that I had misjudged Gardam's Edge, and being surrounded by woodland on both sides, it actually had a distinct character which set it apart from the other edges on today's walk, as well as a lot of history I completely missed out on. As it transpires, the plateau atop Gardam's Edge was once a Bronze Age settlement, and several artefacts have been found in the area. This is why you do your research before the walk.
Okay, this is more like it. Now it's starting to look more like your typical Peak District edge.
While I may have missed out on the history of Gardam's Edge, the views were nonetheless spectacular, and it might well be my favourite edge on today's walk.
I can hear the road getting closer, which means we're nearing the end of Gardam's Edge now. And look at this, the landscape is changing again. We got this, like, birch woodland. Okay, there is Sheffield Road, which we are supposed to cross and head into the woodland at the other side, but I'm going to make a slight change to the plan and just follow the road a little bit until it meets with Clodhall Lane.
That's right folks, we're going off route. By this point in the walk I was feeling pretty exhausted and saw an opportunity to save myself a little bit of time and energy. Instead of heading back across to Baslow Edge, I instead continued up to this crossroads between the A621 and Clodhall Lane. By following the lane for just over a mile, I'd arrive back at Curbar Gap, having shaved about half a kilometre off the trip. This may not seem like much, but when you consider that Clodhall Lane is a straight, mostly flat road, you can see just how much impact this detour made.
Sheep. So after following Clodhall Lane for what felt like an hour, I finally got to Curbar Gap car park, and joy of joys, there was a refreshment stand, so I've bought myself a little pot of ice cream. Okay, we're now starting to ascend White Edge, the 6th and final edge on today's walk.
I don't have much to say about White Edge, to be honest with you, so while I walk, let's get back to that history lesson on trig points. Trig points, or triangulation points, are a series of markers placed all over the country, and indeed all over the world, which were once used to make highly accurate maps using a process called triangulation. It works like this. First, you place a marker, anywhere you like, then place a second marker a precise distance away. Then you can place down a third marker, anywhere you like, and using trigonometry you can work out the exact distance to the other two markers based on the angles between them. Do that a few thousand times and you have a map of Britain. Except there's no need for you to do that because the Ordnance Survey have already done it. Between 1935 and 1962, the Ordnance Survey set out to triangulate Britain more accurately than ever before, and in doing so erected over 6,000 triangulation pillars, most of which followed a standard design created by one Brigadier Martin Hotine, CMG-CBE. Many pillars were installed in prominent areas, that's prominence in the topographic sense, and at the time of their installation, every single pillar would be visible to and from at least two other pillars. Nowadays, triangulation on this scale has been made redundant by the advent of GPS technology, and so most trig points today are little more than interesting landmarks for hikers. Like me. With the trig point reached, I was truly into the final leg of today's walk, and apart from spotting this enormous caterpillar and some distant deer, it was sadly uneventful. By now, I was rushing a bit to get back to the train station to avoid missing my train home and having to wait an hour for the next one. I did come across this unusual monument, which, as it transpires, is a companion stone. This is one of 12 stones in this part of the Peak District created as part of an art installation in the early 2010s. Each stone is a companion to a nearby guide stoop, 18th century signposts which pepper the landscape, and each has a different design and poetic inscription. It turns out that there was also a companion stone at Curbar Gap, which unfortunately I completely missed, but now I know to look out for them on future walks. As I approached Grouse Inn, I really started to pick up the pace, desperate to reach Grindleford railway station in time for my planned train. I crossed the A625, and after just clipping the corner of Longshore Estate, which would make a great visit for a future video, I was back into Hay Wood. The final stretch was pretty tranquil, but of course I was too concentrated on getting back to the station in time to really take it all in. I arrived back into Nether Padley with just 10 minutes to spare, and as this is the end of the walk, I guess it's the end of the video too. Thank you all so much for joining me on today's walk. It's been a pleasure to get back out into the Peak District, and I really hope you've enjoyed being here with me. If you'd like to see more from this walk, including some beautiful 8K photos and a special no commentary version of the video, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter for as little as £1 a month. That's all from me for today, so thank you once again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.
This is a Northern Train to Sheffield.